The price of perfection. Emily's childhood was a silent rebellion, an unspoken tug-of-war between the life her mother designed for her and the life she longed to lead. Linda had set the stage long before Emily could even comprehend the weight of it all. From the moment her tiny hands gripped a brush, Linda was there to guide, to critique, to mold. Every step, every word, every breath was subject to her scrutiny. There was no room for spontaneity, no room for mistakes. It was as though Emily were a character in a play, and Linda was the director, relentlessly pushing for the perfect performance, day after day. When she was 6, Linda enrolled her in her first pageant. "This is your moment, Emily," she had whispered, adjusting the ribbon in her daughter's hair with surgical precision. "Show them how great you are." But all Emily could feel was the tightness in her chest, the pressure of knowing she was not just competing against other children but against the perfection that existed only in her mother's mind. She felt the weight of her mother's gaze as she walked on stage in a sparkling dress that made her look like a porcelain doll, too stiff, too perfect, never able to breathe. At the pageant, Emily won, of course. She always won. But those victories were hollow. Linda's eyes would glisten with pride, but Emily could never shake the sense that she was being measured, not by how happy or fulfilled she felt, but by the applause of a crowd, the approval of her mother's relentless drive. To Linda, there was no such thing as enough. Winning wasn't about feeling good, it was about proving to the world that she, and by extension, her daughter, were superior. And as the years passed, Linda's expectations only intensified. Ballet lessons turned into master classes with renowned instructors, and Emily's natural grace became her mother's greatest asset. But all that grace came with a price. There was no time to play, no time to lose herself in childhood joys. Her life was regimented, planned down to the minute. Every day was another rehearsal, another lesson in how to smile just the right way, how to hold herself just so. Every reflection in a window, every mirror in a store became a reminder of her mother's watchful eyes, ready to catch any imperfection, any flaw. It wasn't just physical perfection Linda demanded, no, it was mental and emotional precision as well. Emily had been taught from an early age to suppress any feelings that might be seen as weakness. She wasn't allowed to show vulnerability, to experience fear or sadness. Instead, Linda reinforced the idea that true strength came from controlling one's emotions, from being the picture of calm and composure at all times. "You are not like other girls," Linda would say, smoothing out her daughter's dress with practiced hands. "You're different, special. You cannot afford to fall short." Despite Emily's growing unease with her mother's demands, she had learned to silence the whispers in her mind. The desire to please her mother, to make Linda proud, kept her moving forward. But there was a hollow ache that followed her every step, like an unhealed wound deep inside her. There was a part of her that yearned to scream, to run free, to experience life outside the perfection that Linda so meticulously curated. But she didn't know how. Emily had been taught that a life of chaos, of mistakes, of imperfection was the greatest form of failure. So she learned to hide those feelings, to bury them under layers of practice, performance, and poise. When she entered high school, the pressure only escalated. Linda's eyes became more demanding. "You need to be the best, Emily," she would say over and over again. "No one remembers second place. No one remembers the girl who didn't win the crown. You want to make something of yourself, don't you? You have to be better than all of them." Emily had become a robot of sorts, going through the motions of life, executing every step with perfection but never allowing herself to live freely. She began to fade into the background, blending into the uniform world that Linda had created for her. To everyone else, Emily was beautiful, graceful, and poised, everything a young woman should be. But to herself, she was an illusion, an empty shell of someone who had never truly lived. That is, until Richard Hamilton entered their lives. Linda had always dreamed of a life far beyond their small town, beyond the quiet confines of the predictable streets and modest homes. She envisioned herself in the high society of big cities, mingling with the rich and powerful, living a life of grandeur. And when Richard Hamilton walked into their world, he seemed like the golden ticket to that dream. Richard was everything Linda had ever wanted, a self-made millionaire, impeccably dressed, and always surrounded by an air of luxury. He was the kind of man who exuded confidence, the kind of man whose very presence made people take notice. Linda saw in him the possibility of a future that far exceeded anything she had ever imagined, and she immediately decided that Emily was the perfect match for him. "You're going to meet someone extraordinary, Emily," Linda said, her voice filled with excitement. "This is your chance to change everything. I've worked so hard for this. I've given everything for you. You will be the one who brings us into the world we belong in." It wasn't lost on Emily that her mother saw her as a tool, a means to an end. Her entire existence had been shaped for moments like this, moments when she could be paraded in front of someone who would see her as the perfect woman, the flawless creation her mother had spent so many years shaping. Emily didn't even have to try to impress Richard. Her beauty, her grace, those were the things he noticed immediately. But unlike any man she had met before, Richard didn't look at her as a person. He didn't see Emily as someone who had dreams, thoughts, and desires. No, Richard looked at her as a prize to be won, a symbol of his own success. He made her feel, for the first time, like she was more than just Linda's creation, but more like a piece of fine art that could be admired from afar but never truly touched. Richard didn't need her to think for herself. He didn't need her to challenge him. All he needed was her beauty, her quiet elegance, and her ability to stand beside him as the perfect woman. He didn't need to know her, because he had already decided who she was. For the first time in her life, Emily found herself caught between two worlds. On the one hand, there was her mother's voice, urging her to impress Richard, to live the life she had always dreamed of. On the other, there was a growing voice inside her, small but persistent, that urged her to break free, to live for herself and not for anyone else. She didn't want to be just an ornament, a trophy placed on a shelf for admiration. She wanted to be seen for who she truly was. But could she escape from the life her mother had built for her? Could she free herself from the expectations that had always loomed over her, silently demanding perfection? And more importantly, did she have the courage to step away from Richard's admiration, to face the reality of being more than just a flawless figure, more than just a creation to be admired? As she looked into Richard's eyes that evening, she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't just trapped by her mother's expectations. She was trapped by her own desire for approval, her own longing for validation. But what would it take to finally break free, to tear down the walls of perfection and step into the messy, beautiful chaos of life? Emily's journey had just begun. And no one, least of all her mother or Richard, could have predicted what would happen next. The price of perfection. Richard Hamilton had seen beauty in Emily the first time they met, but it was not just her outward appearance that captivated him. There was something more, something delicate and controlled about her that drew him in. She was like the rarest of gems, a piece of art that was meant to be admired, but never touched. He didn't want to know her thoughts, her dreams, or her fears. He simply wanted her as a perfect accessory to his life, his symbol of success. At first, Emily didn't see the problem. In fact, the attention Richard gave her made her feel important in a way she hadn't felt before. Her mother had spent her entire life shaping her into a model of perfection, and now she was being rewarded for it. Richard was everything her mother had hoped for, successful, powerful, and able to offer a life of unimaginable luxury. He saw her beauty, not as something fleeting or superficial, but as a reflection of his own stature. Emily was not just his girlfriend, she was a living, breathing trophy. It felt surreal at first, like a dream that Emily didn't know how to wake up from. She was surrounded by the wealth and luxury that her mother had always dreamed of. The parties in penthouses, the fine dining in five-star restaurants, the endless designer clothes, and the constant validation, it all seemed like a fairy tale. But despite it all, something gnawed at her, deep inside her chest. Emily had been so conditioned to seek approval, to be the perfect image her mother had painted, that she never questioned what truly made her happy. She was a living testament to Linda's ambitions, her desires, and her unmet dreams. Yet, the life Emily was living with Richard wasn't hers, it was a life designed by someone else's expectations. It was as though she was just playing a part in a role that didn't feel authentic to her, one where the lines between who she was and who she was supposed to be began to blur. But Richard didn't see any of this. He wasn't interested in who Emily was beneath her polished exterior. He only cared about how she made him look. Linda, too, saw her daughter's beauty as a ticket to the world she had always wanted. The two of them, Richard and Linda, had the same vision for Emily, to keep her in a glass case, forever perfect, forever admired. As their relationship deepened, Emily's discomfort grew. Richard was not unkind to her, not in the traditional sense. He never raised his voice or belittled her. But there was an unspoken understanding between them. Emily was not allowed to deviate from the mold that had been carefully crafted for her. Richard was not interested in her opinions or thoughts. He didn't want to hear her desires, her passions, or her fears. He wanted a woman who fit into his vision of perfection, a woman who would only exist to reflect the wealth and power that he had worked so hard to amass. It was the silent pressure, the constant weight of knowing that her life was not truly hers, that began to suffocate Emily. She began to feel like a mannequin in Richard's world, a beautiful object, displayed for admiration, but never truly seen. The realization came in pieces, tiny moments that gradually built up into an overwhelming wave of disillusionment. Every time Richard would compliment her beauty, every time he would praise her for how perfectly she fit into his life, Emily's sense of self began to fade just a little more. One evening, as Emily stood in front of a full-length mirror in her luxurious penthouse, adjusting the hem of her designer dress, she caught sight of herself. She had been practicing her smile for what seemed like an eternity, just as Linda had taught her. Her posture was flawless, her expression serene, her appearance flawless. Yet in her reflection, she saw something more, something that terrified her. It was the emptiness in her own eyes. She wasn't just adjusting her appearance to look good for others. She was adjusting her identity to fit a mold that had never been her own. She had become a stranger to herself. Who was she, beneath the surface? What did she want, aside from the approval of those around her? Who was Emily beyond the perfect smile, the perfectly composed woman who was admired and adored? Emily stood frozen in front of the mirror, her heart racing. She tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince herself that this life was everything she had ever wanted. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. She could never be truly happy as long as she was living someone else's dream. She had spent her entire life fulfilling her mother's expectations, and now she was doing the same for Richard. But what could she do? She had never been taught how to live for herself. Every moment of her life had been curated, every decision made for her, every step designed to keep her on the narrow path of perfection. She felt trapped, caught in a cycle of seeking approval that she could never escape. The thought of stepping out of this carefully constructed life terrified her. What would happen if she stopped being the perfect woman? What would happen if she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to make mistakes? Emily had spent so many years being the flawless image her mother had designed, and now Richard had taken over that role. But for the first time, she began to see him for what he truly was, a man who valued her not as a person, but as an object to display. He didn't love her. He loved the idea of her. He loved the image of perfection she presented to the world, and that was all he ever wanted from her. As the days went by, Emily's unease grew. Every time she saw Richard, it was as if she was being reminded of her place in his life, not as a partner, but as a symbol of his wealth and success. Richard had begun to subtly hint at the fact that their relationship was an extension of his brand, his empire. "You're my queen, Emily," he would say with a smug smile, "you make me look even more powerful." But Emily knew that his words didn't mean what they seemed. He wasn't complimenting her as a person, he was praising her as an accessory to his lifestyle. And Linda, despite all her grand dreams, wasn't much different. She had spent her entire life pushing Emily toward this exact moment, to the place where she would be seen and admired, but never truly known. Emily felt herself suffocating under the weight of their expectations. She longed to break free, to find out who she was outside of the constraints of perfection. But how could she? She had never been given the space to be anything other than what everyone expected her to be. One night, after yet another lavish gala that Richard insisted they attend, Emily found herself standing on the balcony of their penthouse, staring out over the glittering skyline. The city stretched out before her, a sea of lights that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also empty. Just like her life. Just like her. As she gazed into the distance, a tear slid down her cheek. She wasn't crying for the life she had, no, she had long since abandoned the hope that she could find happiness in the world she had created. She was crying for the woman she had become, the woman who had allowed herself to be shaped into someone else's ideal, the woman who had never dared to dream her own dreams. And in that moment, Emily made a decision. She would no longer live for anyone else. No longer would she be the trophy on Richard's shelf, the perfect accessory to his world. She didn't know what her life would look like without the safety of approval and praise. But she knew that if she didn't start living for herself, she would lose who she was completely. It was time to break free. But the question was, how? And what would happen when she did? Would Richard and Linda accept her for who she was? Or would they reject her for daring to be imperfect? Emily didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain, her journey had only just begun, the breaking point. As the weeks passed, Emily's internal struggle continued to deepen. The weight of her decision to break free from the life that had been meticulously crafted for her felt heavy, yet liberating. The life that Richard and Linda had built around her no longer felt like the dream she had once believed it to be. It was a gilded cage, a prison adorned with luxury, but a prison nonetheless. Richard, blissfully unaware of the turmoil swirling inside her, continued his daily routine of adoration and praise. He would shower her with expensive gifts, take her to exclusive events, and introduce her to his circle of powerful friends as though she were a rare artifact on display. At times, his words would fill her with a hollow sense of pride. "You're the perfect woman, Emily," he'd say. "You belong in the spotlight. You make me look good." But these words, once flattering, began to grate on her nerves. She had become his possession, not his partner. She was no longer seen as an individual with her own desires, her own voice, she was simply an ornament, a reflection of his success. And deep down, Emily knew she could no longer live this way. One evening, after another lavish gala that Richard insisted they attend, Emily found herself once again standing on the balcony of their penthouse. The cool breeze swept across her face, but she didn't feel the chill. Her mind was far from the sparkling city lights below, instead, it was consumed by the overwhelming realization that her life had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. She had become everything her mother had wanted her to be, beautiful, polished, admired. But in her heart, she felt a deep emptiness, a void that could not be filled by wealth or status. The persona she had carefully maintained for so long was cracking, and she could no longer pretend that the life she was leading was hers. Emily had spent so many years chasing perfection, trying to meet the expectations of those around her, but now she longed for something more, something real. She wanted to find herself again, to discover who she truly was, outside of the shell that had been created for her. But how could she do that? How could she escape the life that had been designed for her by others? It was a question that had no easy answer. She had never been allowed to make choices for herself. Her mother had dictated every aspect of her childhood, pushing her to be perfect, to achieve what Linda had been unable to. And Richard, despite his charm and wealth, had only reinforced the same narrative. He had fallen in love with the image of Emily, not the woman behind the facade. Emily's thoughts were interrupted when she heard the soft click of the sliding door behind her. Richard had emerged from the party, his laughter still echoing in his voice, but as soon as he saw her standing alone, he grew silent. "Is everything okay, Em?" he asked, his tone sincere but distant. He hadn't noticed the change in her, he hadn't seen the cracks in the mask she had been wearing. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. She could feel it deep within her, a decision had to be made. But what if she was making a mistake? What if walking away from this life would mean losing everything she had worked so hard to build? The wealth, the luxury, the admiration, all of it would be gone. But Emily knew that the cost of staying in this gilded cage was far greater. She was losing herself, and if she didn't act now, she might never find her way back. Taking a deep breath, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Richard, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending to be something I'm not. I'm not your trophy, and I'm not your accessory." Richard's brow furrowed, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about? You're everything I've ever wanted. You make my life complete." Emily felt a pang in her chest at his words. She knew they weren't meant to hurt her, but they did. They were a reminder of how little he understood her. How little he had ever truly seen her. "No, Richard," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not the perfect woman you think I am. I'm not the perfect woman my mother always wanted me to be. I've spent my whole life living up to someone else's expectations, and I'm done. I need to find who I really am, outside of this, outside of you, outside of her." Richard's face shifted from confusion to anger, his jaw tightening. "Are you saying this isn't enough for you? This life? The fame? The wealth? The status?" "It's not about the money or the status," Emily replied, shaking her head. "It's about me. It's about who I am, who I've lost, and who I need to find again. I can't keep being something I'm not, Richard. I can't keep being your trophy wife, or your perfect little image. I need to figure out who Emily is, for Emily." For a moment, there was silence between them. Richard's face softened, but only slightly. He wasn't used to rejection, especially not from someone like Emily. She had always been the perfect reflection of his success, she was his prize, the woman who validated everything he had worked for. And now she was telling him that she didn't want to be his prize anymore. "You're making a mistake," Richard said quietly, his voice low. "I can give you everything you could ever want. We could have everything. Don't throw it away because of some childish idea of finding yourself. You have it all, Emily." "But it's not enough," she replied softly, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. "I've been chasing approval my whole life, Richard. And I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to chase perfection, and I don't want to live for someone else's dream." Richard's face hardened, his pride wounded. He had always seen Emily as a perfect reflection of his success, and now, in his eyes, she was failing him. He couldn't understand why she would want to throw everything away. But Emily stood firm. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finding something real, something that belongs to me." Richard's gaze narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "If you walk away from me, Emily, you'll lose everything. You'll lose the life you've known. You'll lose me." Emily looked at him one last time, her heart aching. She didn't want to hurt him, but she couldn't live for him anymore. She couldn't live for anyone else. And if it meant losing the life they had built, then so be it. It was a sacrifice she was willing to make for her own peace, her own freedom. With a final glance, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving the life she had once believed was her future behind. As she stepped out into the night, the cold air brushing against her skin, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was making a choice for herself. And though the future was uncertain, Emily finally felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that one day, she would find herself again, the fall and rise. The days that followed Emily's decision were a blur of emotions, confusion, and fear. She had walked away from the life that had defined her for so long, but now, in the quiet aftermath, she found herself wondering if she had made a grave mistake. It felt as though everything she had built, the glitzy lifestyle, the luxury, the image of the perfect woman, had slipped through her fingers like sand. She spent the first few nights in a small, modest apartment she had rented. It was a far cry from the penthouse she had shared with Richard, but it was hers. There were no more high-end designer clothes hanging in the closets, no personal chefs preparing meals, no chauffeur-driven cars waiting outside. Instead, there were bare walls, an old couch, and the constant sound of silence that hung heavily in the air. At first, Emily found solace in the absence of the constant pressure. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the suffocating weight of expectations. But as the days dragged on, a sense of loneliness crept in. She wasn't used to being alone. She had always been surrounded by people, by the glamour of the life Richard had created for her. Now, she was left with only herself. It wasn't long before Emily found herself wondering if she had made a mistake. She thought about the opulent parties she had attended, the red carpet events, the endless compliments about her beauty and grace. But all of that seemed so far removed from who she really was now. In the quiet of her apartment, she realized she had no idea who that woman was. Her mind often drifted back to Richard, to the life they had shared. She wondered if he was doing okay without her, but the thought was quickly drowned out by the gnawing feeling that she had to move forward, not look back. If she was to find herself, she had to leave the past behind, no matter how hard it was. But leaving behind the life she knew didn't come without its consequences. Word of her departure spread quickly through the circles Richard had kept her in. Articles in the tabloids speculated about her reasons for leaving her millionaire husband, painting her as a naive woman chasing a fleeting dream of self-discovery. Her mother, Linda, was less than supportive. The woman who had spent Emily's entire life sculpting her into a perfect image was furious. "How could you throw it all away, Emily?" Linda had shouted during their first phone call. "You had everything. Everything that I could never have, luxury, status, adoration. And you walked away from it. What is wrong with you?" Emily felt a pang of guilt, but she stood firm. "I'm not throwing it away, Mom. I'm choosing to live for myself. I can't live for you anymore. I need to figure out who I really am." Linda's voice trembled with fury. "You're being selfish. Don't you understand? You could have had everything. The world was at your feet. But now, you're throwing it all away for what? Some childish fantasy of finding yourself? You'll regret this, Emily. I know you will." But Emily wasn't sure what was worse, her mother's anger or the crushing loneliness she felt in the face of her newfound freedom. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was drifting aimlessly, unsure of where to go next. The future, which had once seemed so certain and secure, was now a wide, open expanse that terrified her. One morning, as Emily sat by the window, gazing out at the city that had once felt like her kingdom, she realized something crucial: she had no idea what happiness even looked like anymore. Was it about finding another rich man? Was it about building a career in something she didn't care about? Was it about regaining the fame she had lost? No. She had to redefine happiness on her own terms, without the pressures of anyone else's expectations. She remembered the childhood dreams she had once harbored, dreams that had been crushed under the weight of her mother's ambitions for her. She thought about the passion she had once felt for art, for creativity, for expression. When was the last time she had painted? When was the last time she had allowed herself to simply enjoy the beauty of life without worrying about how it would appear to others? In that moment, Emily made a choice. She would return to the one thing that had always brought her peace, her art. It had been a part of her before the world demanded that she become a trophy. It was something she could control, something that was truly hers. With renewed purpose, she signed up for art classes at a local community center. She began to spend her days immersed in paints and brushes, sketching landscapes, painting abstract images, and letting the emotions she had long suppressed flow out onto the canvas. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like herself. She didn't have to worry about the opinions of others or whether she looked perfect. All that mattered was the art. At first, her paintings were simple, raw, and unrefined. But with time, they grew more complex, more nuanced, as she rediscovered her artistic voice. She didn't care about the outside world anymore. She was no longer trying to please anyone, least of all her mother or Richard. She was painting for herself, expressing the parts of her soul that had been buried for so long. As her skills developed, she began to see the beauty in the imperfections of her work. Each brushstroke, each splash of color, was an act of liberation. She wasn't trying to meet someone else's expectations, she was finding joy in the process itself. Slowly, Emily began to realize that the perfection she had always been taught to chase wasn't real. It was a facade. What mattered was authenticity, being true to herself. But just as Emily began to find peace in her new life, fate threw another curveball her way. One afternoon, as she was leaving her art class, Emily was approached by a woman who introduced herself as a gallery owner. She had seen Emily's work on social media and was intrigued by the raw emotion and depth in her paintings. The gallery owner offered her a chance to showcase her art in a small exhibition. Emily was stunned. It seemed too soon, too sudden. She had only just begun her journey back to herself, and now, her art was being recognized. Was she ready for this? Could she handle the pressure that came with such an opportunity? But as she stood there, staring at the woman, Emily realized something profound. She wasn't just ready for it, she deserved it. This wasn't the world of false expectations or polished facades. This was her chance to show the world the real Emily, the woman who had fought for her freedom, who had found herself through the power of creativity. With a newfound confidence, Emily agreed to the exhibition. She no longer cared about being a trophy. She no longer cared about pleasing anyone. She was finally on the path to becoming the woman she was always meant to be, free, authentic, and unapologetically herself. The exhibition was a success, far beyond anything Emily had anticipated. People were drawn to her work, to the emotion and vulnerability that poured from the canvas. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as Richard's wife or Linda's perfect daughter, but as Emily, the artist. And as Emily's art began to gain recognition, she realized that this was only the beginning of her true journey. The fall from the life she once knew had been painful, but it had led her to a place of growth and empowerment. She no longer needed to be anyone's trophy. She was her own masterpiece, and the world would see her for the first time, exactly as she was. The unraveling. Emily's newfound sense of freedom began to grow like a flame in her heart, fiercely burning away the remnants of her old life. The life where she had been put on a pedestal, admired for her beauty in her role as the perfect trophy wife, now felt like a distant memory. The loneliness that she had once feared now seemed less suffocating than the shallow expectations that had once dictated her every move. But even as Emily reveled in her self-discovery, the shadows of her past life kept creeping back, pulling her into their web of complex emotions. The art exhibition had been a resounding success, but as the excitement of that achievement faded, it left her with a deeper realization. It was not just the glossy world of high society that had shaped her, it was the people who had guided her there, and it wasn't just her mother she needed to heal from. As she continued to work on her paintings, Emily found herself haunted by Richard's image. She had walked away from him, but that didn't mean the echoes of their life together didn't still reverberate in her thoughts. She would often close her eyes and remember the way he would look at her, the pride in his eyes when he showed her off, the adoration that felt more like ownership than love. She remembered the way he would call her his trophy, his perfect woman, as though she were just another piece of art on display. But over time, as Emily poured her heart into her art, the sharp edges of that memory began to soften. She realized that Richard hadn't just been a part of her past, he had been a symbol of her own captivity. He had been a reflection of the mold she had tried to fit into, a mold that ultimately shattered when she decided to break free. His world, the world of power and status, was built on a foundation of vanity, but she was no longer interested in building anything on that shaky ground. Yet, despite all this clarity, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her escape had left something behind, an unfinished chapter. She began to feel as though she was somehow still tethered to that world, that part of her life. She was constantly bombarded by reminders of who she had been, whether it was the society pages, tabloids, or her lingering guilt about her family's expectations. Her mother's calls became more frequent, and with each conversation, Linda seemed more desperate for Emily to return to the world she had so eagerly rejected. "You were meant for more than this, Emily," her mother would say. "The art thing is just a phase. You're throwing your life away." But Emily was no longer the same woman who had once dreamed of perfection under her mother's exacting gaze. The more she rejected her mother's view of success, the more she understood that it wasn't her mother she was running from, it was the version of herself she had allowed her mother to create. Her mother had never seen her as an individual with her own desires, dreams, or imperfections. She had always been a vessel, a creation to show off to the world. Linda's love had been conditional, and Emily could no longer bear the weight of that love. One afternoon, Emily stood before her canvas, staring at the empty space. She had been working on a new piece, one that she hoped would encapsulate her journey, but nothing seemed to come. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts scattered, and it wasn't long before she realized what was holding her back. It wasn't just her past that haunted her, it was the fear of failure. The fear that, no matter how much she tried to break free, she would never be enough. That her art, her independence, and her pursuit of happiness would always fall short of the expectations placed upon her, whether from Richard, her mother, or even herself. She had felt the weight of those expectations since childhood. The pressure to be perfect had been her constant companion, and now, even in her moment of freedom, it still had a grip on her. It was as if a voice, her mother's voice, still whispered in her ear, reminding her that she could never truly escape. But instead of succumbing to those doubts, Emily did something that surprised even herself. She left her apartment one evening, driving aimlessly through the city streets. The city, once so intimidating, now felt strangely comforting. It was a place of noise and movement, but also a place of anonymity. Emily drove until she found herself in front of a small cafe on a quiet street. The sign outside was unremarkable, but something about it called to her. Inside, the cafe was warm and inviting, with low lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. She ordered a coffee and sat down at an empty table near the window, watching the world pass by. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. There were no expectations, no eyes on her. She wasn't Emily the wife, Emily the trophy, or even Emily the artist, she was just Emily, a woman sitting in a cafe, enjoying a quiet moment. It was simple, but it felt like the most genuine thing she had experienced in years. As Emily sat there, the realization hit her like a wave, she wasn't running from her past anymore. She wasn't trying to outrun the life Richard had built for her, or the expectations her mother had burdened her with. She had no more walls to break down, no more doors to escape. She wasn't chasing anything. She had already found what she needed, her own peace, her own voice. And in that moment, she realized that this was her true liberation. It wasn't in the art world, it wasn't in the rejection of her past, and it wasn't in the approval of others. It was in the quiet acceptance of herself. The truth was, Emily had been searching for a life that was hers, not the life Richard wanted her to have, not the life her mother had planned for her, but the life she had always dreamed of. A life without the shackles of perfection. A life where she could make mistakes, where she could fail, where she could simply be human. And it was in that simple, ordinary cafe, that she found the courage to let go of the last remaining vestiges of her old life. She walked out of the cafe that evening with a newfound strength, knowing that her journey was far from over. There would be more struggles, more doubts, more moments of vulnerability. But this time, she would face them as herself, not as the trophy she had been, but as the woman she had become. She wasn't defined by the past anymore, nor by the expectations of others. She was, at last, truly free. The next day, Emily went back to her studio, determined to finish the painting that had eluded her for weeks. She didn't know what the final piece would look like, but she no longer cared about perfection. It wasn't about creating a masterpiece for the world to admire, it was about creating something that spoke to her soul. As her brushstrokes began to fill the canvas, Emily realized that the beauty of the journey was not in reaching the destination, but in the freedom to create, to change, and to embrace the unknown. This was her life now, unpredictable, messy, and wonderfully her own. And she was finally ready to live it, not for anyone else, but for herself.